Marc Millis is going to talk about breakthrough propulsion. He was on Zoom a minute ago. I hope he's still there. Marc, over to you.
Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, a couple announcements. This is actually my last career presentation. I will be retiring at the end of this month, and I don't expect to do any more work along these lines, but personal communications are welcome. The other announcement is that the grant that we've been working on was a 3-stage grant, and the funding to complete the 3rd stage is presently unavailable. In the meantime, the Ohio Aerospace Institute will be retaining those materials, and Jim Gilland will be taking over as the principal investigator on that. Next slide. Basically, things I'm going to cover is a quick refresh of what the purpose of the grant was, and then the progress we made towards a database of interstellar mission vehicle concepts. Next. Okay. The overall grand goal of this was to create a catalog or database of all the diverse concepts for interstellar propulsion. And by interstellar, we don't mean the precursor stuff to reach a few hundred AU. We mean actually reaching neighborhood stars and exoplanets. And in doing so, to set this up so that we could impartially compare the differing things. And this isn't just for like the first missions, the first flyby things, but to also consider ongoing advancements and things that might let you slow down. And to make totally fair comparisons, we need to include the system level factors, including the infrastructure and how much power there might be available to do these things. And with this, it's not just the concepts, but also the research plans to advance those concepts, which includes readiness factors and what you might do next. Eventually, we'd want this to be online so the professionals could update information as it came available, and also even provide something for the public to help convey the status of these things. Next slide. The work was broken into 3 pieces. The first piece was, well, if you want to make fair comparison, what are the right questions? What's the fewest things that you need to understand or to ask to do that? And how would you begin to analyze these things? And what are some of the challenges that we really need to face? The second stage is then to actually start to create databases, getting answers to those questions. And then the third stage was to complete those and do the analyses and make it suitable for posting online. Next slide. Okay, in order to make comparisons, prior to all this, the usual metric for what constituted a good mission is who could get there first. But that often left off details of, well, can you actually pull that off energy-wise? And is there even going to be a payload there when you get it? So to bring in and using fairly traditional capabilities, schedules, costs, and risks. And this is a short list. So the figures of merit for making comparisons of these ideas is in the context of a mission. The more payload mass and more payload power you can get there, and the better data rates for sending back, the better. The more time that you're near the target and the more data you plan to take, the better. As far as expense, absence of any cost models and, well, a number of things, distill that down to just some fundamental physics basics, energy and mass. So the more mass it takes to complete the mission, and that includes infrastructure, the more expensive. And the more energy that it takes to do the mission, in other words, if you have a less efficient propulsion method than another, the more expensive to do the mission. The scheduling factors, there's so much of that, like the anticipated launch here, that has so much uncertainty in it by virtue of not only technology development, but any infrastructure that needs to be built. But at least there. The other things that's changed is before, one of the measures was how quickly can you get there, and realize that when you started looking at things, the time to send the data back could be a significant portion of the trip time. So defining the mission time from launch to data return instead of arrival. Risks. Normally that's considered in terms of mission success, but at this stage where things are so undeveloped, the risk of whether or not the technology will actually mature to make these things possible in the time frame you might be interested in. So the lower the technology readiness level, the higher the risk. And this is the one that we began to encounter as we were beginning to put together databases. The amount of missing information or information that just does not look plausible means for higher risk. And another one that I could go into some length is that when you start seeing concepts that their performance levels are at the theoretical limit, well, there's a considerable risk in that. If you look at prior technology, nothing ever really reaches its theoretical limit. You know, it usually gets up to like maybe 80%, maybe 90% or whatever, but not. So if something needs to be at the theoretical limit to work, then it's going to be considered more risky than something that's, say, at 60% of the theoretical limit. Next slide. One of the things that we needed to set up to compare very divergent propulsion methods, you know, some are talking beam power and sail area and things like that. Other ones in terms of thrust, ISP. So how to distill those down to ultimately measure how good something was, we have to put it in terms of the mission, how much payload mass, how much delta V, things like that. And measuring expense in terms of how much energy will it take to provide that. And to do the analysis, to break it down into, and distilling these things into simpler systems that cover the wide variety of options was certainly a major challenge of this. But breaking it down into 4 categories where there's kind of standard equations for each, depending upon where the power source is and the reaction mass. And so for like your classic rocket, whether it's a nuclear rocket or a chemical rocket, both the power and the reaction mass is on board. For your classic sails, both your power and your reaction mass is separate in the spacecraft, reaction mass being the photons that are hitting the sail. And then if you have onboard propellant and you're beaming energy to do it like a solar electric propulsion, which for interstellar really isn't that promising, that would be a 3rd category. And the last category where you have some form of onboard power, but you're interacting with the surrounding medium, whether that's stellar wind or stellar plasmas, or even the concepts for the warp drives and space drives. So coming up with that scheme and the equations go with it to do those comparisons on the propulsion. Next slide. We ended up having to break down the databases in 4 parts because there wasn't one that could easily encapsulate all. And even when we got into it was hard to distill these down into smaller things. So the first one is on mission vehicle concepts, an actual package deal where you have a point design propulsion thing, you're sending a certain mass to a certain destination, and we completed a first iteration on that. Another one is the the propulsion devices with some performance measures so you can compare them to different missions. Another database is for the research needs and some assessment of the technology readiness, meaning where's your starting point and what actual research might you need, time and cost to advance these ideas. And the last one, mostly for the sake of creating consistent baselines to compare ideas that need infrastructure, is what is the anticipated future of in-space infrastructure to support these things. Next slide. To give you an example of the kind of questions that we asked, and that URL is for the survey. I don't know how much longer that's going to be there. We're actually not actively taking data right now, but it was an online survey to collect the information. And so some of the obvious ones is, okay, who's submitting the information and what's the concept? Where do you plan to go? What do you plan to do when you get there? You know, your delta V's, your payload mass. What sort of timing are you looking for? Do you need infrastructure? And if so, how much? And then some more details, mission architecture. What's your delta V for departure? Do you plan to slow when you get there or even stop or even possibly return? Robert Forward included some mission concepts for actual return. So that's why that's in there. And then to specify your main propulsion. And that's where it's broken down to conditional questions depending upon what propulsion type you have. and to include the possibility where there's a different propulsion method. Say you do use one for accelerating and then another one for decelerating. We repeat the same sort of questions if you have a secondary propulsion question. And then the last one was some added details, realizing that, a lot of these things, to do fair comparisons, we need some more details, and wanted to see if that information was there, like a little bit more on the payload and the design priorities and the technology readiness levels, at least in the rudimentary fashion. So that was the question set for the first database that we actually set up. Next slide. The process is, well, we pretty much had the questions sorted out when we started this next effort. And then we obtained a subcontractor to put the databases together. And we went to a company that's called DataWise. They're originally called Mondo Brain. And we went with them because they had analysis methods built in that could accommodate sparse data. In other words, if there was missing pieces of data, as well as extremely large data sets where they already had built in some functions to look for correlations that you might not otherwise be looking for. And the method of populating that was an online questionnaire. It took several iterations to match the questions with how their database and surveys work. It was a fair amount of work. Then we did some trial runs with a few subject matter experts, invited 6, 3 participated, and saw that, okay, yeah, this is manageable. And then we invited 37 other subject matter experts to submit some concepts, to actually fill things in. And after that, we got 12 concepts entered in. And then so the next step was to develop the display and assessment dashboards for, okay, now how will you look this information and sum it up? And what we found is that there was a lot of missing information. When we did the surveys, we realized you're not going to be able to answer all the questions. And some are there that if you have an answer, great, but answer what you can. But the amount of missing information, and then also wrongly enter information. In other words, when we ask for a point design on a specific propulsion thing and someone answers back, we'll see our online site. It's like, no, that's not the right way to answer the question. So we weren't really able to make much progress there. So the dashboards and the other things are pretty provisional and in development. Next slide. The lessons learned from this effort is that it is indeed challenging to try and look at all these complex ideas for interstellar flight and to distill them down into some sort of uniform way to compare them and something that's succinct. We had pretty fair participation from, and this is even though the numbers there are for the database, but even over the life of this, pretty fair participation from the subject matter experts in the community. Specifically to the database, about 1/4 of the people asked actually responded. The missing information, that is definitely something that makes it hard to make comparisons. For example, the time on target. How close do you need to get? How close do you plan to get? What sort of data you take? Give us some sense of, if you're going to go there, what are you going to do? In at least some way to make some fair comparisons. And if not, then we're going to have to set some standard and then compare everyone to that standard payload or whatever and see whether or not their propulsion system can deliver. There's also a lot of missing system level details, like the mass of thermal radiators and the degree of infrastructure dependence, how much mass you need for that propellant depot or a large in-space laser station. If funding resumes, the remaining work will be to complete the databases for the propulsion system, the research plans, and then the infrastructure. To complete the analysis tools, integrate that with data with NASA, so that because there's more than one way in the course of this too, including the features from the subcontractor of how you're looking at the information. One of the example there is that people have different priorities. So it's like, okay, well, what's the fastest or what's the most payload, things like that. And then once those get squared away, to convert this over for online access, both for the professional one where you can log on and update and correct information, and then to the public education summaries. Next slide. And this is a work in progress. And this was a concept for, if you wanted to try and distill down, say, a trading card for an interstellar mission vehicle concept, and down to the least number of performance parameters, what would they be? And as you can see, there's a lot of performance parameters on there, not just one or two. And, flight speed is one, but also the capabilities. Well, how much mass are you going to take there? How much energy is going to take? What's the technology readiness level? And all sorts of things. So, and in the final report, this will be explained a little bit more what each of those numerics are. And these are the kind of things that in the database, the questions were asked for, many of which could not be answered. Next slide. Okay, and I'm just going to leave this up and then open it up for questions. But this is the list of the concepts that were entered into the database. I went ahead and entered forward Starwisp, his Rendezvous to Alpha Centauri, and then also the round trip one. Also entered in the Daedalus one, and then I'll let you look at that list for your own of the other concepts that were submitted. And with that, I will open it up to questions.
Thank you, Mark. So I'm going to do a little combination here. So do you anticipate successful completion of the project?
Oh gosh, I have no idea about that because that's not only funding dependent, but also dependent upon available skills after. And yeah, at the end of this month, I'm done. So I haven't been thinking ahead about that. My co-PI, Jim Gilland, would be the one to ask, and Mike Lapointe is my NASA COTR. Okay.
And the other half of that was if there is not that public database that you talked about a couple slides ago based on continuing funding, is there a way that researchers could access this work? Are there any white papers about this work, or would emailing you be the best way to learn more?
Okay, we are working on a final report that will have a fair number of details, including, for example, all the list of questions that were on the plan database and also the draft database. The actual information that was submitted, the spreadsheet for that, there has not been plans to try and condense that down, in part because the kind of information that we got in the total and the number of times that someone said, go see my website, was disappointing.
Thank you. Was any hardware developed for testing?
No.
Figured that'd be a nice quick one. Are there still, let's see, we got a couple things here. What do you think a time frame would be for humans to actually accomplish interstellar travel?
There's two factors to that. One is the available energy to do these things is substantial compared to the amount of energy that actually humanity produces. And so to make a devoted effort to do that would take a bit. And now the Starshot folks who plan a Earth-based 100 gigawatt laser thing, I mean, I don't remember what their timelines are, but even that's not quick. But and that's just for something extremely small. For some of these larger envisioned ones, or say a payload that's over 10 grams, the amount of infrastructure you need to support that might be a lot. So, we're talking at least decades, and there can be a fair amount of debate on what that is, depending upon factors that have a lot more to do with priorities than technology. But I would say no sooner than decades to be able to launch the first thing. And if you extrapolate for the level of like propellant depots for doing helium-3 and whatever, you might be talking half a century or perhaps two.
Okay, thank you. I think we got time for one more. A personal question. You spoke about the end of the project. Are you personally still going to pursue quote unquote physics entrepreneurship?
No, I've kind of saturated or burned out, so I don't expect that I'm going to dabble in these topics anymore unless it's at a fictional level.
Great. Thank you, Mark.